Black man banned from marrying millionaire. Years later he searches for her in a Ferrari when Charles Hartwell kicked David Washington out of the mansion 5 years ago, shouting that no black man would ever be part of this family. He thought he had closed that chapter forever. On that devastating December night, Isabella Hartwell stood frozen at the top of the marble staircase, watching the man she loved being publicly humiliated by his own father in front of 50 guests from Beverly Hills high society. David had arrived at the engagement party driving a used Honda Civic, carrying a ring that had cost him 3 months' salary as a junior engineer at Peterson Technologies. At 28, he genuinely believed that love would overcome any social barrier. His naivety cost him dearly. Charles Hartwell not only rejected the marriage proposal, he made a point of publicly shattering David's dignity, declaring that the family would never allow Isabella to lower the family name by associating with someone of that social standing. The awkward silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Isabella's heels climbing the stairs, leaving David alone in the center of the room while the guests whispered cruel comments. When he begged her to say something, anything in his defense, Isabella just looked away through the window. Family pressure, the threat of disinheritance, and the weight of a lifetime of privilege spoke louder than the love he felt. David was escorted to the exit by hired security guards, as if he were a dangerous intruder. The last image he had of the Hartwell mansion was Isabella watching from the second-floor window, tears streaming down her face, but without the courage to come down and fight for their relationship. He left carrying not only public humiliation, but something far more devastating, the certainty that he had been abandoned by the only person he truly trusted. Now, 5 years later, the unmistakable roar of a red Ferrari Portofino echoed through the same garden where David had been escorted away like a criminal. The sound of 600 horsepower made Isabella drop the teacup she was drinking from on the porch, running to the window with her heart racing. She instantly recognized the male silhouette that had haunted her dreams every night for 5 long years of regret. What made Isabella freeze in terror was not only recognizing David, but realizing that he was driving a car that cost more than most families' annual income. For 5 years, she had wondered where he was, if he had managed to rebuild his life after the humiliation. The answer was coming in a way she could never have imagined. David Washington stepped out of the vehicle wearing a perfectly tailored Armani suit, custom-made Italian shoes, and a watch that glinted discreetly on his wrist. There was a cool elegance in his movements, a calculated confidence that had not existed 5 years earlier. The shy, vulnerable young engineer had been transformed into something completely different, a man who radiated power and authority in a way that made the air around him seem thicker. Charles Hartwell watched from the library, his hands trembling imperceptibly as he held a glass of whiskey. At 58, the patriarch was secretly facing the worst financial crisis in his family's history, information he had managed to hide from Beverly Hills society, but not from his most discerning creditors. David's presence at that particular moment could not be mere coincidence. David walked slowly toward the main entrance, each step echoing on the imported marble like a sentence being carried out with surgical precision. There was no hurry in his movements, only the patience of someone who had waited 5 years for this exact moment. Rejection had been transformed into fuel, humiliation into determination, and now the time had come to settle the score. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hartwell," David said when Charles appeared hesitantly in the main hall. His voice carried a cold authority that made the entire room tense. "I've come for Isabella. I believe we have unfinished business that requires immediate resolution." If you're enjoying this story of transformation and justice, subscribe to the channel right now, because what David revealed in the next few minutes about how he had spent those 5 years and what he really knew about the Hartwell family's most intimate secrets will prove that some revenge is planned with the patience of a strategist who never forgets humiliation. The silence in the main hall of the Hartwell mansion was suffocating. Charles swallowed hard, trying to maintain the aristocratic composure he had cultivated for decades, but there was something in David's eyes that made him feel like prey being assessed by a patient predator. Isabella finally descended the stairs, her hesitant footsteps echoing on the marble that had witnessed her cowardice 5 years earlier. "David," she whispered, her voice laden with a devastating mixture of nostalgia and guilt. At 32, Isabella carried in her eyes the indelible mark of someone who had made the wrong choice when it mattered most. For 5 years, she had lived a seemingly endless string of empty relationships with men approved by her family, heirs to old fortunes, bland executives, ambitious politicians, but none had been able to fill the void left by David. The tears Isabella had held back for 5 years finally fell when she saw the man she loved standing in the same room where she had betrayed him. David looked at her coldly, showing no trace of the emotional vulnerability he had displayed the last time they were face to face. The transformation was terrifying, It was like looking at a stranger wearing the face of the person she had loved most in her life. Charles tried to regain control of the situation, his voice carrying his usual aristocratic arrogance. "Washington, I don't know what game you're trying to play, but this family has nothing left to discuss with you. Isabella is engaged to Richard Pemberton III, heir to Pemberton Industries. The wedding is in 3 months." The words came out with the calculated coldness of someone accustomed to deciding people's fates as if they were pieces on a chessboard. David smiled with a coldness that made Charles instinctively retreat. "Pemberton Industries," he repeated slowly, savoring each syllable. "The same company that just lost a $200 million contract with the Department of Defense due to technical irregularities? An interesting choice for a son-in-law, Mr. Hartwell." The information hit like a bomb. The contract was confidential, announced only 24 hours earlier. How did David know? What Charles couldn't understand was how a former junior engineer could have access to classified government information. There was something about David's presence that suggested knowledge far beyond what any ordinary person should possess. The terrifying question was, who was David Washington really? Isabella watched the confrontation between the two men with growing unease. For 5 years, she had tried to convince herself that she had made the right choice, that financial and social security were worth more than true love. But seeing David again, transformed, powerful, radiating a confidence she had never seen before, she realized that she had lost not only a boyfriend, but possibly the only man who would love her for who she really was, not for the surname she carried. David opened an Italian leather briefcase and spread documents across the antique mahogany desk. "Speaking of lost contracts," he said with the calmness of a surgeon making a precise incision, "I believe you've been facing some financial difficulties lately. Hartwell Oil has lost 3 major clients in the last 6 months. The stock is down 40%. The banks are pressing for loan payments totaling approximately $50 million. Charles's face paled dramatically. That information was absolutely confidential, known only to him, his lawyers, and the bank executives involved. How did David have access to such intimate financial data about the family business? Panic began to set in as he realized that his desperate financial situation was no longer a secret. "How did you?" Charles stammered, his arrogance quickly evaporating. David ignored the question, continuing with the coldness of someone presenting evidence in a court of law. "Fortunately for you, I have an interesting proposal. My company is willing to buy 60% of Hartwell Oil shares at current market value, also assuming the outstanding debts. This would save the family from imminent bankruptcy and preserve the Hartwell name in Beverly Hills society." Isabella felt the ground crumble beneath her feet when David revealed that he was no longer a simple engineer, but the owner of a company powerful enough to buy the family empire that had rejected her. The irony was devastating. The man her father had despised for not having adequate financial means was now the family's only salvation. "What is the price of this generosity?" Charles asked, his voice trembling slightly. David looked directly at Isabella, his eyes carrying 5 years of pain transformed into cold determination. "The price, Mr. Hartwell, is a private conversation with your daughter. An honest conversation about choices, consequences, and second chances." Charles Hartwell left the room with stiff steps, leaving David and Isabella alone for the first time in 5 years. The silence that settled was heavy with unresolved history, unspoken words, and regrets that had fermented for half a decade. Isabella remained standing near the staircase, as if ready to flee again if the conversation became too much to bear. "You've changed," Isabella said finally, her voice almost a whisper. David looked at her with the expression of someone studying a curious object in a museum, interested, but emotionally distant. "It's not just the clothes or the car. There's something different in your eyes. A coldness I've never seen before." David walked over to the window overlooking the garden, the same spot where Isabella had chosen to watch his humiliation 5 years earlier instead of coming down to defend him. "You're right," he replied without turning around. "I've changed completely. I had to change. That naive young man who believed that love would conquer all died in this room 5 years ago." Isabella felt tears burn her eyes when David finally turned to face her. "I thought about you every day for those 5 years," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I wondered where you were, if you were okay, if you had found someone who loved you the way you deserved. I knew I had made the wrong choice, but it was too late to go back." "Was that really true?" David asked with disturbing calm. Or did you simply prefer the safety of known cowardice to the risk of unknown courage? The words cut deep because they carried a truth Isabella had tried to avoid for years. David approached slowly, stopping at a calculated distance, close enough for her to feel his presence, far enough away to maintain emotional control. Do you want to know what I've been doing for the past 5 years, Isabella? Do you want to know how a simple engineer became someone capable of buying the family business that rejected him? What David revealed next completely changed Isabella's perception of who he really was. During their 3-year relationship, he had hidden his true identity for a reason she could never have imagined, and which now explained both his transformation and his intimate knowledge of the Hartwell family business. My full name is David Montgomery Washington, he began, watching Isabella's expression gradually change from confusion to utter shock. Montgomery, as in Montgomery Tech Solutions, the cybersecurity firm your family quietly hired 6 months ago to investigate corporate information leaks. Isabella felt the ground fall away beneath her feet. Montgomery Tech Solutions was one of the most respected technology companies in the country, known for working exclusively with Fortune 500 corporations and government agencies. If David was really the owner, that meant he had not only become extremely successful, but that he had been monitoring her family's business for months. During our relationship, I chose to live as an ordinary engineer because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for what I had, David continued, his voice carrying a melancholy he tried to mask with coldness. When your father rejected me for not being financially suitable, I realized I had been naive to believe that emotional honesty mattered more than social status. David took out his smartphone and showed Isabella a series of photographs that made her instantly pale. They were pictures of her with Richard Pemberton III at exclusive restaurants and high-society social events, always smiling for the cameras with the empty expression of someone playing a role. You look happy in the photos, he commented with bitter irony. The truth is, I never stopped loving you, David admitted, his mask of coldness cracking slightly. For 5 years, I built myself up imagining this moment of reunion. But I also prepared myself for the possibility that you had genuinely moved on, that you had found real happiness with someone else. Isabella realized she was at a crossroads. David hadn't returned just to get revenge on the family that had rejected him. He had come back to find out if the love they had shared had been real or if she was just another person who valued him only for what he could offer. Richard is a good man, Isabella said hesitantly, but you're right. I don't love him. Not the way I loved you. The engagement was a practical decision, not an emotional one. David nodded slowly, as if her confession confirmed something he already knew. Then now we come to the real reason for my visit. I didn't come here to get revenge on your family, Isabella. I came to offer you a choice you didn't have 5 years ago, the chance to choose love over convenience, knowing exactly what the consequences of each decision are. David's proposal echoed through the room like an ultimatum laden with 5 years of pain and transformation. Isabella realized she was facing the most important second chance of her life, and this time, there was no family pressure, no threats of disinheritance, just a pure choice between courage and convenience. David had returned not as the vulnerable young man who had begged for acceptance, but as a man who had become powerful enough to rewrite the rules of the game. What exactly is the choice you're offering me? Isabella asked, her voice trembling slightly. David approached the table where he had spread out the financial documents that sealed the Hartwell family's fate. Each piece of paper represented years of meticulous work, silent investigation, and strategic preparation for this exact moment. It's simple, David replied with the calmness of a surgeon explaining a complex procedure. You can go through with the arranged marriage to Richard Pemberton, preserve your family's approval, and live the rest of your life wondering what if. Or you can choose to walk out of this house with me right now, knowing that your family will face the financial consequences of their own decisions without my intervention. Isabella felt the devastating weight of a lifetime of cowardly choices converging in this moment. 5 years of regret, sleepless nights wondering where David was, empty relationships that never filled the void he had left. It all came down to this decision that would define who she really was deep down in her heart. Charles Hartwell appeared at the entrance to the room, having obviously overheard part of the conversation. His face was pale, his eyes betraying the panic of a man who saw his family empire hanging entirely on the benevolence of the young man he had publicly humiliated years earlier. Isabella, you can't seriously be considering abandoning your family for him again. David turned slowly to Charles, his eyes carrying an authority that made the patriarch instinctively retreat. Mr. Hartwell, your daughter is not abandoning her family. She is choosing to prioritize her own happiness instead of perpetuating a cycle of decisions based on fear and prejudice. What Charles didn't know was that David had spent 2 years gathering evidence not only about the family's financial situation, but about all the talented young people the Hartwells had rejected over the years because of race or class. David's revenge wasn't just personal, it was systemic, designed to expose patterns of discrimination that extended far beyond his own case. "There's something you need to understand, Mr. Hartwell," David continued, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "Over the past 5 years, I haven't just built a company. I've meticulously documented how families like yours use racial and socioeconomic criteria to determine who is suitable for your social circles. You weren't the only ones to reject talent out of prejudice, but you'll be the first to face the public consequences of that practice." Isabella realized that David had returned with something far more powerful than money. He had returned with the ability to publicly expose the discriminatory behavior of one of Beverly Hills' most respected families. The irony was devastating. The man they had rejected for not being suitable now had the power to destroy the social reputation they valued above all else. David opened his laptop and showed a presentation that made Charles turn completely pale. It was detailed statistics on how many interracial relationships had been sabotaged by high-society families in California over the past 10 years, including specific names, dates, and methods used to pressure young people into ending their relationships. "Montgomery Tech Solutions doesn't just work in cybersecurity," David explained coldly. "We also offer consulting on corporate social responsibility. Several companies are interested in knowing which families and individuals engage in systematic discriminatory practices before they enter into business partnerships." "The choice isn't just Isabella's," David declared, his gaze shifting between father and daughter. "You also have a decision to make. You can continue to perpetuate prejudices that belong in the last century, facing the social and financial consequences of that choice. Or you can acknowledge that you have misjudged not only me, but probably dozens of other people over the years." Isabella looked at her father, seeing for the first time in her life a powerful man completely without options. David had engineered a situation where any choice Charles made would result in significant consequences. If he rejected David again, he would lose both his daughter and his financial salvation. If he accepted, he would have to publicly admit that his prejudices were wrong. "Isabella," Charles said, his voice breaking, "the decision is yours. I can no longer make decisions about your life based on my own fears." David held out his hand to Isabella, but not as an ultimatum, as an invitation. "The choice is genuinely yours," he said softly. "There is no pressure, no threats. Just the opportunity to choose what your heart truly wants, free from outside influences." Isabella looked at the outstretched hand, realizing that this time the choice was entirely hers, without family coercion or financial pressures. David had become powerful enough to ensure that her decision would be based solely on love, not convenience. Isabella stared at David's outstretched hand for long seconds that seemed like an eternity. 5 years of regret, guilt, and empty relationships converged on this decisive moment. Without saying a word, she intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the same electric connection she had experienced on their first date years ago. The difference was that now they both understood the true value of what they were choosing. "Dad," Isabella said, turning to Charles, her voice firm for the first time in years. "I choose love. I choose the courage I should have shown 5 years ago." Charles nodded slowly, resignation mixed with something that seemed suspiciously close to relief. Perhaps deep down he knew that his daughter would never be truly happy living for his fears. David walked Isabella to the Ferrari, opening the passenger door with the elegance of a gentleman who had learned that true strength came from kindness, not imposition. Before getting into the car, Isabella took one last look at the mansion where she had grown up, realizing that she was leaving behind not just a house, but a version of herself she never wanted to be again. As they drove through the streets of Beverly Hills, Isabella finally asked about David's plans for his family. He smiled for the first time since he had arrived at the mansion, not the cold, calculating smile he had worn during the confrontation, but the genuine warm expression she remembered loving. "Montgomery Tech is going to buy Hartwell Oil shares at full market value," he revealed. "Your family won't face bankruptcy. They'll just have to learn to work with people they once despised." 2 years later, Isabella and David were married in an intimate ceremony in Hawaii, far from the spotlight of California society. Charles Hartwell not only attended the wedding, but gave a speech publicly apologizing for the prejudice he had shown. Hartwell Oil, now a partner of Montgomery Tech, had become one of the most progressive companies on the West Coast in terms of diversity and inclusion. During the reception, David revealed that he had used the 2 years of transition not only to integrate the companies, but to create a scholarship fund exclusively for talented young people from marginalized communities. The best revenge, he explained to Isabella as they danced, is not to destroy those who hurt us, but to ensure that others do not suffer the same humiliation we faced. Isabella had discovered that the man she had lost because of cowardice had not only become financially successful, but had developed an emotional wisdom that transformed pain into positive purpose. David had learned that true power did not come from the ability to humiliate others, but from lifting them up and creating opportunities where once there were only barriers. David and Isabella's story spread quietly through Beverly Hills social circles, inspiring other young people to question the family pressures that prevented them from following their hearts. Several high society families began to re-evaluate their own prejudices, realizing that true social status came from the ability to recognize human value regardless of color or economic background. 3 years after the wedding, when Isabella gave birth to twins, Charles Hartwell held his grandchildren with tears in his eyes, whispering apologies for almost depriving the family of the happiness they now experienced. David watched the scene with the satisfaction of someone who had turned rejection into collective redemption. The most elegant revenge, they discovered, was not to destroy those who had hurt them, but to show that true love always finds a way to prevail when supported by courage, patience, and the wisdom to turn adversity into opportunities for growth. David had proven that dignity maintained under pressure and strategic intelligence applied with a noble purpose were weapons more powerful than any direct confrontation. If this story of transformation and second chances touched your heart, if you believe that true love can overcome any prejudice, subscribe to the channel right now and share in the comments your own experience of how the courage to make the right choice can completely change the course of a life. Because in the end, the best stories are not about revenge, but about how strength of character can transform even the hearts most hardened by prejudice.